Most men don't fail loudly. They just stop noticing the gap between who they said they'd be and who they became. This is where that gap gets named. This is the revolutionary man. There's a particular kind of cost that doesn't announce itself, doesn't send a notice or mark the day on the calendar. It just closes. And you don't know it closed until you go back and open it and find it isn't there anymore. Not damaged, not difficult, just gone. That's what this episode is all about. Not what's still narrowing, that was episode 17. Not what was being written, that was episode 15. This is about the windows that have already closed. Named precisely because the cost of the gap isn't only what's accumulating now. Some of it has already been settled. And some of it closed quietly while you were looking somewhere else. The honest accounting requires us to name it, not to produce despair, but to produce clarity. Because clarity about what's closed is the only thing that tells you accurately what's still open. Here's how these closings work. They don't happen dramatically. There's no moment where something snaps shut and you feel the finality of it all. They close the way seasons change, just gradually, then completely. One day, the thing that was available simply isn't anymore. And because there's no marked moment, you can spend a long time still picturing it as being available, still telling yourself that you'll get to it, still oriented towards something that has already become a wall. This is the nature of opportunity costs most men in your position have been careful not to look at directly. Because looking requires us to acknowledge something that can't be reframed as temporary. The behavior ledger from Act 2, you can change what gets written going forward, and the blueprint from episode 14, what your kids carry is real, but the relationship continues. And the present chapter from episode 15, still open and still being written, but a closed window, that's different. It's the part of accounting where the number is fixed. It doesn't change when you decide differently tomorrow. It sits in the ledger as the permanent record of what the gap cost while it was running. And high-performing men are comfortable with sunk costs in business. You account for the loss, and then you redirect. You don't keep investing in something that's already gone to avoid the discomfort of reading the number. That same discipline is what this episode asks of you. Not grief and not self-punishment. Just an accurate reading of the settled portion of the ledger. You've stood in front of the difficult numbers before and you named them plainly. This is that. So what have you been treating as still available that closed while you were planning to get to it? Let's look at our first window. Your children are specific ages right now, and the ages they are today are the ages they've never been before and ever will be again. That's not sentiment, that's math. The relationship available with a child at 7 is categorically different from what's available at 12. Not better or worse, it's just different. At 7, a child still narrates the interior world out loud. They bring you the small things, they dream they had, the moment at school that felt wrong, the thing that they can't quite name but need to put somewhere. That access is age-specific. At 12, that narration has gone interior. Not because interior world is smaller, it's just richer than ever. But because they've learned from 1,000 small signals who gets access to it, and those signals came from the years before 12, from whether bringing things to you produced connection or distraction, from whether the door was open or managed. The relationship available with your child at the age they were 5 years ago is just not available now. Not because something broke, but because the window was age-specific and that age has passed. The relationship continues, other windows exist, but what was possible in that season with that version of them is no longer on the table. And the cost of the gap includes whatever went unrealized inside it. And here's what makes this cost different from the ones in Act 1 and Act 2. In recognition and friction, everything pointed toward what you could still change. But this cost doesn't have a revision clause. You cannot go back to the years when your son was 7 and be differently present in them. Cannot recover the version of your daughter who brought you the small things before she learned not to. The window existed. You were in it. And what happened in it is what happened. That's not an indictment, it's just a ledger entry. And the reason it read so clearly is the same reason you read any ledger clearly. So you know exactly what you're working with moving forward. What was available in your relationship with your children at ages they'll never be again, that closed while you were planning to show up differently. Let's look at our second window. Your marriage should exist. That's not what this is about. This is about a version of it that existed before a particular distance became the default operating mode. Before avoidance and managed presence became so established, they stopped feeling like choices and started to feel like the relationship itself. There was a version of this marriage where the distance wasn't structural yet, where the patterns were still forming, where what became the architecture was still just behavior, changeable, not yet calcified. That version had access. The current one, it doesn't. And it's not because the person across from you changed fundamentally, but because a kind of relational possibilities exists in the early chapters of a pattern that disappears once that pattern becomes the operating system. Conversations are now loaded with years of unresolved distance were once just conversations. Silences that carry the weight of adaptation were once just pauses. The version of your spouse who still brought things to you openly, before enough attempts went nowhere, that bringing things became irrational hope, that version existed. And the version of the marriage available when both of you were still oriented towards each other rather than operating around each other, that version, it had a window. It closed the way drift closes things, just gradually, without a moment that you could point to. And the version that existed before distance became architecture is not recoverable through effort because it requires a different history to exist. The marriage, it continues. Work is possible, but that specific version, the window is closed. So what version of your marriage existed before the distance became the default? And when did that window close? Let's look at our third window. This is the one that most men are least likely to name. Why? Because it requires looking at yourself not as you are, but as you were before a certain accumulation of choices made the current version feel like the only one. There was a version of you before the pattern calcified. Before 1,000 small decisions that added up to a settled way of operating became so established, they stopped feeling like decisions and started feeling like character. That version hadn't made those choices in quite this sequence, hadn't yet built the architecture of professional priority and managed emotional presence that became your operating system. The pattern felt like choices then because they were new enough to feel chosen. Now they feel like you. And that shift from chosen behavior to felt identity happened in one small decision at a time, without a moment that you could actually point to and say, this is where it was set. So what the earlier version had access to wasn't different values or different capacity, just less accumulation structure to move through to reach the people who need you present. That version, well, it's gone. Not the man, the version of the man who hadn't yet built this particular architecture around himself. And this isn't about self-condemnation. It's the same clear-eyed accounting you'd apply to anything else on the balance sheet that's no longer there. So what version of yourself existed before the patterns felt like identity? And what did that version have access to that this one has to work harder to reach? So there we have 3 windows. Your children are at ages now past, the version of your marriage before drift became the operating mode, and the version of yourself before the patterns were set, named, not dramatized, and we're not minimizing them. The reason to name them isn't for us to produce regret. It's because you cannot allocate accurately toward what's still open if you're oriented toward what isn't. Pretending, it's going to cost you twice. Once when the window closes, and then again when you spend energy pointing at something that no longer exists instead of toward what does. And the move that changes what comes next isn't emotional processing of what's been lost. It's the same move you make in any domain when an asset is no longer available. You write it off the balance sheet cleanly. Not because it didn't matter, it did, but because carrying it as though it's still available distorts every decision that follows. You cannot build an accurate forward picture while closed windows are still showing up as assets. So write them off, not as an act of resignation, as an act of precision, so that the resources you still have, your presence, attention, time, the version of you that exists today, gets directed at what's actually available to be built. The closed windows, they're closed. The cost is real and it's fixed. What's still open is the only place that the resources can do anything. And that's what we're going to talk about in episode 17. Band of Brothers, where men stop negotiating with closed windows and we start building through the ones that are still open. And if you're ready for that, go to therevolutionaryman.com/Band of Brothers and complete the integrity mirror. Ready when you are. Thank you for listening to the Revolutionary Man podcast. The cost of staying asleep doesn't wait for you to be ready. Take the integrity mirror. It's a 15-minute assessment that shows you exactly which man you've become and what it's costing you. Go to therevolutionaryman.com/the mirror.